Welcome back, everyone. I hope you're doing well. Today we'll be reacting to the Anglo-Saxon King's family tree. Don't know much about this at all. This is 100% a learning video. So sit back, relax, and let's learn together, shall we?
Hi, this is Jasmine from the YouTube channel A Long Time Ago. Today I'll be guest narrating for useful charts in order to show you the family tree of the Anglo-Saxon monarchs. In Matt's video on the British monarchy, he started with Alfred the Great and then traced the line all the way back down to Queen Elizabeth II.
We gotta do that video too.
But we can actually trace the royal line several hundred years further back. You see, prior to the emergence of the Kingdom of England, Alfred's ancestors ruled over a kingdom known as the Kingdom of Wessex. Wessex was just one of 7 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that existed in England prior to, well, England. So today I'm going to show you the family tree of some of the most important monarchs who ruled during the Anglo-Saxon period.
Let's do it. W useful charts, as always, right? Hit that like button, people. Let's go. Learn.
Let's start with some background. From 43 to 410 CE, the area now known as England was a province of the Roman Empire called Britannia, and it was mostly inhabited by a group of Celtic people known as the Britons. However, in the year 406, things started to change. In that year, Germanic armies crossed the Rhine River for the first time and started to take over the Western Roman Empire. By the year 410, the Romans were no longer able to keep troops in Britain and therefore abandoned the province. Sometime after this, Germanic tribes started to invade the shores of Great Britain, although there is evidence that some Germanic peoples arrived before this time as well. These Germanic invaders came from 3 main tribes: the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. It is from the Angles and the Saxons that we get the term Anglo-Saxon, and from the Angles that we get the word English.
I still don't know where the Jutes went. Like, that's a blind spot in this. Like, where did the Jutes go? Did the Jutes like cease to exist?
Over time, through a process of migration and assimilation, the language and culture of the area went from being primarily Brittonic to being primarily Anglo-Saxon, with many Britons being pushed into what is today Wales. Eventually, 7 main Anglo-Saxon kings.
Wait, so the Britons became Welsh?
Kingdoms emerged. The Anglic kingdoms of Northumbria, Mercia, and East Anglia, the Saxon kingdoms of Wessex, Essex, and Sussex, meaning West Saxons, East Saxons, and South Saxons, and the Jutish kingdom of Kent. This is why this
the Jutes became Kent
period is also sometimes called the Heptarchy, meaning the 7 kings. In reality, though, there was never a time in which all 7 kingdoms were equally strong. For example, throughout much of the Anglo-Saxon period, Mercia was the dominant power, and then, eventually, it was Wessex. Okay, let's now return to the family tree. At the top you can see the names of the 7 kings who are credited with having established the royal lines associated with each of the 7 kingdoms. On this chart, yellow represents the 3 Anglic kingdoms, red the 3 Saxon kingdoms, and purple the single Jutish kingdom. However, please note that the coats of arms you see above each line did not actually exist at the time. Heraldry wasn't really a thing until 600 years later, during the High Middle Ages. So each of the shields you see here are simply later inventions that were attributed back to the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms.
I didn't know the origin of those. Like, I didn't know. I thought that was always a thing. So like 900-ish is when we brought shields and what's it called? Coat of arms.
Long after they were gone. Another later invention that was attributed back to the early Anglo-Saxon kings was the title of Bretwalda, which literally means Britain ruler, and which was kind of a similar title to that of High King. Although the title probably didn't exist initially, later chronicles assigned it to the various Anglo-Saxon kings who were thought to have been the dominant ones. So, for example, the first 4 Bretwalders were said to have been Alla of Sussex, Cheolin of Wessex, Athelbert of Kent, and Radwald of East Anglia. King Athelbert of Kent is notable in that he was the first Anglo-Saxon king to convert to Christianity. This was largely due to the fact that he married a Merovingian princess, the woman now known as Saint Berta. However, his actual conversion is credited to Saint Augustine of Canterbury, not to be confused with the more famous Saint Augustine of Hippo.
So I'm guessing everyone's Catholic prior Is that what we're saying? Or or pagan? I'm not sure.
Note that the current leader of the Church of England is known as the Archbishop of Canterbury, a title that traces its origins back to the Augustine who converted Athelbert. Athelbert was also supposedly a direct descendant of Hengist, Hengist and Horsa being the two legendary brothers who were said to have led the initial Anglo-Saxon invasion. For the remainder of this video, we are going to focus on the three largest Anglo-Saxon kingdoms: Mercia, Wessex, and Northumbria.
Okay.
Let's start with Northumbria. Northumbria was originally two kingdoms, Bernicia and Deira. However, Bernicia and Deira eventually merged due to a rather messy sequence of events. To explain, let's start around the year 600, which happens to be around the time that King Athelbert of Kent became the first Anglo-Saxon king to convert to Christianity.
Okay.
Around this time, the king of Bernicia was a man named Athelfrith, and the king of...
These AE things really throw me off. I'm having to get used to it.
Deira was a man named Athelric. The exact detail named to convert to Christianity. Around this time, the king of Bernicia was a man named Athelfrith, and the king of Deira was a man named Athelric. The exact details are unclear, but it seems that Athelfrith eventually conquered Deira, perhaps killing Athelric in the process. This led to Athelric's brother Edwin being exiled, where he eventually wound up in the court of King Radwald of East Anglia. Athelfrith thus became the first king of both Bernicia and Deira. However, after about a decade of ruling over both kingdoms, Athelfrith was attacked by the armies of Radwald. Radwald killed Athelfrith and placed his ally Edwin on the throne instead, thus making Edwin the second king to rule both Bernicia and Deira. Around the same time, King Athelbert of Kent died, leaving Radwald as the most powerful king and hence the new Bretwalda. I should also point out that Radwald is thought to have been the owner of the Sutton Hoo helmet, an ornately decorated helmet found in a ship grave during an archaeological excavation in 1913.
Hold on, we got it. Look at that. That thing looks cool. So do we have that relic still?
Decorated helmet found in a ship grave during an archaeological excavation in 1939. Anyway, Edwin eventually married the daughter of Athelbert of Kent, and as a result, he too converted to Christianity. When Radwald died, Edwin became the fifth Bretwalda, but fighting continued between the kingdoms, and eventually Edwin was killed by King Penda of Mercia, who had allied with the Welsh king Cadwallon. At this point, Bernicia and Deira were once again split into two kingdoms, with Edwin's kinsman Osric taking Deira, and Athelfrith's son, Eanfrith, taking Bernicia. Note that Athelfrith had actually married Edwin's sister, Atcha, and thus Eanfrith was Edwin's nephew. However, the Welsh king Cadwallon continued to attack Bernicia and Deira, and eventually managed to kill both Osric and Eanfrith.
Wait, I need to back up.
Eanfrith was Edwin's nephew. However, the Welsh king Cadwallon continued to attack Bernicia and Deira, and eventually managed to kill both Osric and Eanfrith. Later chroniclers would blame this on the fact that both Osric and Eanfrith had reverted their lands back to paganism. The stage
so they were pagan prior to Christianity. Okay.
Was thus set for the sixth Bretwalda, Eanfrith's brother Oswald. During Edwin's reign, both Eanfrith and Oswald had been exiled to Scotland, where they converted to Christianity. But unlike Eanfrith, who dropped his new faith upon becoming king, Oswald remained Christian. According to legend, he stuck a large wooden cross in the ground before a battle against Cadwallon, and for this reason was able to win back both Bernicia and Deira. Whether or not this is actually true, what
it's symbolism at its finest, though.
Is true is that during his reign, Christianity became firmly entrenched in England. After his death, Bernicia and Deira were split for one final time. Oswin, son of Osric, took Deira, and Oswy, brother of Oswald, took Bernicia. But eventually, Oswy had Oswin killed and managed to take hold of Deira.
You gotta be really looking back and forth when you're watching this video, because these names are so. First off, they're very old English, so you gotta especially the AE, you gotta kind of understand the pronunciation and the dialect and all that. But more or less, they're very similar names. If you look Eanfrith, Icfrith, Osrid, Osric, Oswin, Oswu, very, very, very similar.
Thus, in the year 654, Bernicia and Deira were formally merged to create the Kingdom of Northumbria, under the rule of Oswy. In order to cement the deal, Oswy married Eanflad, the daughter of Saint Edwin.
Okay.
Thus, Oswy became the 7th and final Bretwalda. However, the main thing Oswy is remembered for is defeating Penda, king of Mercia, at the Battle of Wynward. Penda was the last major pagan king to rule over an Anglo-Saxon kingdom, and his death at the Battle of Wynward is seen as the end of pre-Christian England. Oswy was followed by Edgefrith, a son of Eanflad, and then by Aldfrith, a son by his second wife, Finn, who was an Irish princess. Aldfrith married Cuthber, sister of King Ina of Wessex, and together with her had Osred, and possibly Osric. Osric was the last king from the main line of Northumbrian kings. After his death, the throne passed to various, more distant relatives, starting with Ceolwulf. It was in Northumbria during the reign of Ceolwulf that the famous monk known as the Venerable Bede lived. Bede's many writings are arguably the...
He wrote a lot about the assimilation of the Britons and the Saxons and Anglo-Saxons, from what I know.
Most important sources for the Anglo-Saxon period. In fact, he is considered to be one of the most important historians from early Christian Europe.
Yeah.
Okay, at this point, let's turn our attention to the Kingdom of Mercia, which was located just below Northumbria. The word Mercia comes from the word march, which at the time simply meant the borderlands. In Mercia's case, the name likely referred to the border between the Anglo-Saxons and the Britons. So, initially its rulers were simply the leaders of the border folk, but eventually the area evolved into a kingdom that was officially known as Mercia. Their line starts with a man named Ichel, who, unlike all other Anglo-Saxon kings, actually had royal roots back on the continent. He is said to have been the son of the last Anglic king of Germany. However, please keep in mind that the early genealogy for all of these families is a bit sketchy, and therefore should be taken with a grain of salt. For example, most of the Anglo-Saxon genealogies list all of these kings as going all the way back to the god Woden, who is known in Norse mythology as Odin. The first really powerful king of Mercia was Penda, who I've already mentioned as being the last major pagan king from any of the 7 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms.
What a name, Penda. Penda.
However, after Penda's death, his sons converted to Christianity. Peada was the first to rule, but he did so as a subordinate to Oswy of Northumbria. He was murdered in less than a year, making his brother Wulfhere the next king. Wulfhere managed to gain back control of Mercia from Northumbria, and it was during his reign that Mercia replaced Northumbria as the dominant Anglo-Saxon kingdom. Wulfhere was followed by his brother Athelred, and then by his son Coenred, and then by Athelred's son Coelred. We then get to Athelbald, a descendant of Penda's brother. Athelbald reigned for 41 years, which is the longest verifiable reign for any Anglo-Saxon king.
Wow.
He was the dominant king when Bede was writing. However, Bede did not give him the title of Bretwalda, presumably because Bede was writing to explain the past, not the present. Athelbald would likely have reigned even longer. However, he was assassinated, resulting in a brief civil war, which was won by a relative of his named Offa. Offa of Mercia is generally seen as being the greatest of all the Anglo-Saxon kings prior to Alfred the Great. Some even consider him to be a precursor to the later kings of unified England. His reign coincided with the reign of another great king over on the continent, that of Charlemagne. In fact, the reign of another great king over on the continent unified England. His reign coincided with the reign of another great king over on the continent, that of Charlemagne. In fact, the two corresponded several times on matters of diplomacy. At one point, it seemed that Charlemagne's heir would marry one of Offa's daughters. However, that didn't end up happening. Offa is also remembered for building Offa's Dyke, an 8-foot-high mound of earth that stretched 177 miles from the top of Wales all the way to the bottom, and to this day still roughly marks the border between England and Wales.
That's pretty cool. That's pretty cool.
After a nice long reign of 39 years, Offa was succeeded by his son Edgefrith, and then by a distant relative named Coenwulf. However, in the decades that followed, Mercia started to decline, and Wessex would soon replace it as the dominant power. So, let's turn our attention to Wessex. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, the royal line of Wessex is the line from which the current British royals descend.
Wasn't that because, and you can also, like, Westminster, isn't that what, wasn't that the first capital?
It started with a man named Cerdic. If you, like many people, are able to trace your lineage to one of the early Plantagenet kings of England, then Cerdic is also one of your ancestors, and probably the earliest ancestor that you can trace a line to with any certainty. However, keep in mind that during the lifetime of Cerdic, the Kingdom of Wessex didn't actually exist yet, and in fact he might not even have considered himself a king. Instead, he was probably simply a tribal leader, his tribe being known as the Yewisse. It was not until the reign of his great-grandson, Cerdic, who was the first in the dynasty to convert to Christianity, that the title King of the West Saxons, or King of Wessex, was used. Cerdic was followed by his son Caernwald. However, early on in the reign of Caernwald, Wessex came under the direct control of Penda of Mercia for a few years. This is why you can see a gap in his regnal dates. Also, some sources indicate that, after his death, his wife Seixbur reigned for about a year.
Oh.
If this was the case, it would be quite notable, as Seixbur would be the only queen to rule in her own right during the entire Anglo-Saxon period.
Now that is different. Wow. Interesting. So, is it confirmed? That would be really cool.
Earlier, Caernwald might also have married a sister of Penda. It is thought that Cohen...
I'm laughing just because there is no name, it's just sister of Penda.
Wolf of Mercia, and his descendants may have descended from this line. Anyway, after Seixbur, the throne jumped around a bit between several kings, whose exact lineage is unknown, before moving to a totally different branch of the family, the one that descended from Ceolin, who I mentioned earlier as being the second Bretwalda. The first king from this branch was Cadwalla, and then Inna. During their reigns, Wessex reached its greatest extent up to that point, dominating the kingdoms of Kent, Essex and Sussex. However, after Inna, Wessex came under the influence of Mercia for almost a century during the reigns of Athelbald and Offa, and the throne of Wessex jumped around between several more distant relatives. That all changed with the arrival of Egbert. Egbert was the great-great-grandson of Inna's brother, and his father had been appointed sub-king of Kent. Just prior to Egbert's reign, the throne of Wessex had been held by Beorhtric, a son-in-law, and therefore a likely puppet king of Offa. But Egbert managed to regain independence for Wessex, setting the stage for Wessex to become the new dominant power. In fact, later chroniclers writing in Wessex listed Egbert as an 8th Bretwalda, which shows some obvious bias on their part because they skipped over the Mercian kings of Athelbald and Offa, who arguably deserved the title as well. Egbert was followed by his son Athelwulf, who was in turn followed by 4 of his sons in succession, the last of whom was Alfred the Great. During the reign of the third son, Athelbert, a major event occurred that would eventually lead to the unification of England.
Yeah, Alfred the Great, of course, is noted as like the first king of England prior to the conquest, right? I think so.
That event was the arrival of the Great Heathen Army, a massive coalition of Vikings who launched a major attack along the eastern seaboard of Great Britain. Over the next several years, the Vikings were able to conquer much of Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, and Essex. But after Alfred the Great came to the throne, the tide started to shift. In 878, Alfred fought the Viking leader Guthrum in the Battle of Edington, and won, decisively. At this point, England was basically divided in two, with the Viking-controlled areas becoming known as the Danelaw, and the Anglo-Saxon areas coming under the rule of Alfred. In fact, in 886, Alfred declared himself to be the king of the Anglo-Saxons. He was followed by his son Edward the Elder, with his son-in-law Athelred, and later his daughter Athelflud, overseeing Mercia. Edward the Elder continued to gain ground against the Vikings, and 2 of his daughters married the most powerful rulers on the continent, Charles the Simple, king of the West Franks, and Otto the Great, king of the East Franks, who would go on to become the first real Holy Roman Emperor.
Whoa.
Edward the Elder was followed by Athelstan, who in 927 defeated the final Viking stronghold at York, and became the first king of a totally unified England, although at the time his actual title was King of the English.
So Athelstan was the first real king of the English, but Alfred was the first king of the Anglo-Saxon unification. Okay.
Thus marks the end of our journey. From this point on, the story continues in Matt's video on the British monarch's family tree, which traces the line from Athelstan all the way to Queen Elizabeth II. You can find a link to that video in the description. Before I go, I want to address one last thing. What about King Arthur, the most famous legendary king of Britain? Well, the key word there is legendary. King Arthur is said to have lived in the days following Hengist and Horsa, and keep in mind that he was a Briton, not an Anglo-Saxon. So he would have been on the side fighting against the Anglo-Saxon invasion. But everything we know about King Arthur comes from legends that were written many, many centuries after his supposed lifetime. Although there are several historical characters who have been put forward as possible inspirations for King Arthur, the fact of the matter is that there is actually no historical evidence for his existence. But if you want to hear more about King Arthur and his fictional family tree, we do have a video on that. I'll leave a link to that in the description as well.
Yeah, I don't want to watch a fictional tree. We all about like reality here. But thank you guys so much for watching. This was really interesting. A huge blind spot for me is pre-British monarch, pre-William the Conqueror, Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. I had a chance when I went to the British Museum to kind of like really start to look at a lot of the relics and the antiquities of the time. And it's crazy how some of these things have survived thousands of years. And it's just so interesting, right? You have Britons, which are pretty native, where you had a Roman, I wouldn't say invasion, but you had a Roman, not conquest either, lack for the better word, conquest, and then you have Anglo-Saxon Jew conquest, and then eventually you have the Vikings intertwining every few hundred years, and then of course you end up with the Normandy conquest with William the Conqueror, and it's just it's an assimilation. There's no like native people that have lived there and became from the roots, and I think that's just about everywhere. And that's my stance on land. Land is land, people are people. Assimilation happens everywhere. You see that in the United States. You see that in East Asia. You see that pretty much everywhere. So it's just how it is. Thank you guys so much for watching. Leave a recommendation below. Peace out. Bye-bye.